Thanks, Maurice. I actually got myself a private pilot's license and flew in Israel and in France. I don't do it anymore, though. It's a lot of work. That was lovely, thanks. It's very true. Maurice spoke about the relationships and being able to help each other using your networks. This is something we do at the MIT Forum. When people come to consult, we often suggest other people they should speak to. And actually a company that Yossi Vardi's main, most famous success, ICQ, presented here at the MIT Forum several years back when they were still called Mirabilis, and one of the people in the audience went to speak to Yossi Vardi. She invested in the company, and the rest is history, and we have such success stories as well. Our last speaker today is Joan Vogelesang, President and Chief Executive Officer of Toon. If I read you her biography, our hour will be over. So, she has a huge experience in managing firms, and a number of times she has done what we call turnaround, taking a company that needs to go a new way, is either failing or is not moving on fast enough, and developing it into a company that's actually growing. The story of Toon is very exciting, and what Joan did was first of all, she developed the vertical that the company was in, so that it wasn't selling only to one kind of client, one product, but the whole scale of products. And the other thing that she did is developing the product geographically. Joan, would you like to take it from here?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to say how delighted I am to be here. It's a very daunting task, I must say, to follow these two brilliant ladies. So I certainly hope that, that I can be a fraction as interesting and as dynamic. I would have to say that I was very fortunate, I suppose, in my career really to have worked with some of the best companies in the world. So I was with IBM for a number of years. Then Philips Electronics and Hitachi Data Systems before entering into a more entrepreneurial environment at Toon. I suppose that I felt that I experienced my first major failure at Philips. And I thought I'd briefly touch on that because I do believe that it helped to guide me through my second major failure. You know, at Philips, I led a team that developed really the first multimedia PCs that entered into the world market. And at that time, there weren't any multimedia computers. And we had a load of XTs in the warehouse that were really gathering dust, and we bought a company in New York called Head Start. Head Start was managed by a gentleman called Harry Fox, who subsequently moved back to Israel. But Harry was probably one of the most brilliant marketeers at that time that I had ever met. And when we bought that company, Harry said, you know what you really should do with those boat anchors in the back of the factory is put a CD-ROM in them. And this was an interesting perspective, and I thought it was a great idea. Philips had all of the technology you may know for CD-ROM, and so we approached them first to design the CD-ROM so that it could be actually used by real consumers, and they refused. They laughed at us, and in fact, at that time, Philips in Eindhoven was largely, the board were largely Dutch, and it was very inwardly focused. People were quite carried away with the fact it was a $68 billion company, even though they were losing at that time $2 billion a year. And so we actually went to Sony and talk Sony into designing these CD-ROMs, and which they did. We kept their factory open for a year and a half, and then we went to companies like Software Toolworks and Grolier Encyclopedia. We got them to come up with content that we could load in and have the first plug-and-play computers in the world. And at the same time in the factory, we became the first ISO 9001 certified PC factory in the world. But it was interesting that what we came up against really was the old guard in a company that could not think outside of the box. And so when we had the executives over from Eindhoven and we said, look, computers are going to be used predominantly by home users, and we think that they are the people that are going to lead the charge, small business and home unit users, they actually fundamentally disagreed with us. And the CEO at that time, Jan Timmer, decided that he would prefer to put the money into something that at that time was called CD Interactive, which did nothing. It did no computing at all. You could tour through a museum or something with it, but there was no interactivity. And so even though we were manufacturing at that time 400,000 or 500,000 computers a year, and we became really the standard, we ended up selling our last design to Compaq, and that became the Compaq Presario, because we designed the first upgradable motherboard, and as a matter of fact realized that we needed to be able to design a motherboard in 6 months versus the 18 months that it was taking previously. That Compaq Presario catapulted Compaq into being the biggest PC sales company and manufacturer in the world, and was ultimately sold to Hewlett-Packard. So it was interesting that within that large organization, because of the lack of vision that was taking place at certain levels, that even though you had the best technology, in fact you ended up closing a factory and putting thousands of people out of work. So then you might say, well, how did I end up in a company like Toon Boom? It just so happened that a lot of people with experience from large companies at a certain point wanted to figure out, did they actually know what they were doing, and could you go into a company of a much smaller nature and enable it to succeed? And I must admit that I agree with a fair amount of what was said earlier. But just to tell you what we do at Toon Boom, we are a software engineering firm, and we design technology for animated productions, but also for consumers and for education. So we're 17 years old, and I, in fact, took the company over from the original founder just over 15 years ago because the company was in trouble at that time. And I'll just explain to you what we do, and then I'll explain to you why we were in trouble and how we got out of it. The venture investors was exactly one of the reasons, and I'll just briefly tell you why that was a significant problem for the company. However, prior to that, I'll tell you who our customers are. So our first major customer was Disney, and is still our largest customer. But we, in fact, are in all of the major studios around the world with at least one of our technologies. So over 80% of the major studios use our technology. We have studios working with us in 122 countries, and we can support in over 20 languages. So I'll take you back to the beginning when we ran into these issues. The board were looking for someone that had international experience in running an engineering team, but plus managing international business, building international business, selling into international, in an international environment. And I was ready to come out of the very large organizations and decided to enter into this company knowing absolutely nothing about animation, but thinking I had some other attributes that could in fact be very useful to the company. At the time that I entered into the company, it was a single product company. we're headquartered, by the way, out of Montreal in Canada. Currently, we have 100 employees, the bulk of them being software engineers, but of course, a fair number of business development people, product marketing. Vice President of Marketing is here with me today. She was educated at this university, which is probably why we do as well as we do now. But when entering into the company, the first problem that I had was that a major competitor, the day that I arrived, stole every employee that we had in our California office. And the idea that they had at that time was that if they took all of our employees, that they would get all of our business. So this was a major issue. I hadn't yet learned the business, and I was faced with the fact that someone was taking a very predatory stance. So I decided that the best thing I could do was sue them. And the reason that I decided that was not that I actually had a leg to stand on, but that I thought it might slow them down. And so I went to one of these lawyers in California, not really being able to afford them. But in fact, they did take our case on. And they were looking for a smoking gun. But in the meantime, the judge said, you are not allowed to go into their accounts in any way whatsoever as a result of having stolen all of their employees. So that gave me time to go to Disney and Warner Brothers and Universal and Cartoon Network, etc. In fact, our management team flew all over the world, myself, the chief technology officer, vice president of marketing, anybody that we could find that we could put on a plane, and met each one of our customers personally and said, look, this has happened and we are asking you please to give us time to sort it out and to stay with us. And in fact, they all pledged to stay with us, which was it was great. It was a great result. And as this lawsuit was proceeding and the legal fee was just in excess of $400,000, which for us at that time was an awful lot of money, and we were going through the discoveries, and our lawyer convinced me that I was going to do better in the discoveries than they were because I was the one that looked honest. I phoned him and I said, look, we have no more money. I can't pay you anymore. Oh, he said, just give me $15,000 more dollars. And I thought, we're $400,000 in the hole. 15,000 is, I said, okay, you got 15,000, and you won't believe what happened in that period of time is that Nomura, a very large Japanese company, had invested in this small British company, and they wanted to do a deal, and they couldn't do it while this lawsuit was hanging over their heads. So they had to fold their cards. They paid our expenses. We subsequently bought that company, I think about 7 years ago. About 7 years ago, we actually ended up buying it. So that was my first crisis on entering into Toon Boom, and I thought, whoa, this is good news. I made it through that one. When we ran into the situation that the original founder had brought into the company some venture investors. Now, at the very beginning of the company, there were a lot of angels, which isn't that great either, by the way. You don't want too many of them. So there were a lot of them. Everybody that was anybody in Montreal had put $500,000, $400,000 into this company. And then we had what were called the Quebec investment people. So it was the Case, which manages a very large pension fund. There was Innovatech. There were all these they were encouraging small and start-up Quebec companies. So they were in. And we had this one product, but had an idea to develop a more consumer-oriented product, and in came Minhas Mohammed Venture Partners. So Minhas Mohammed Venture Partners, the circumstances were just onerous, and we absolutely could not live up to them. And so I actually approached them and I said, look, can we do a deal with you? We're supposed to have this money paid back in 3 years, and you're supposed to do this and that. Could we stretch it out a bit longer, lower the obligations? And anyway, cut a long story short, he said no. And there was a reason, by the way, that he said no, because at that point there were very attractive tax credits in Quebec for research and development companies. And he was doing an entire business on investing in these companies, thinking that when he put the heat on, the investors were going to cough up the money. But what happened was that those very same investment companies decided that this particular year they weren't interested in startups anymore. They were going to go for the top 20%. And so they couldn't be pressured. And he actually tried to take the company away from us. We did have at that time a major, let's call it customer, in a company called Nelvana that does about $78 million of production in Canada a year. And they sat on our board. So I actually went to maybe 28 different potential investment types to try to clean this up. And the problem that we were in was that with all of the angels, no one could see how they were going to make money. And so I had to take the company literally through a financial restructure, which means, to be polite, through a bankruptcy. And at that point, my decision was, if we're going to go through this, I needed an A-team. So we chose, no, it was Ernst & Young. I was going to say Pricewaterhouse, but it wasn't actually. It was Ernst & Young who was working on the Air Canada deal. So Air Canada Toon boom. And I got a great law firm. Our board at that time, when I said from the management viewpoint that we were going to take this company through a restructure, this is something I learned, by the way. Has anybody else taken a company through this type of activity? Oh, well, this is great. I'm the only one. So at least I'm talking to you about something new. You know what the board does, by the way? They all resign instantly. And you're standing there all alone. So the minute that I said I was going to do this, because of course we had investment people on the, they just all resigned. And myself and the chief financial officer, we felt like we were the kamikaze twins, because we're thinking, here we are, how are we going to make payroll? And the other thing that the board recommended was that we should fire all of the people and go down to 5 people. Well, first of all, I totally refused to do that, because we're in a technology business where all of the intelligence is in the brains of the people. So I said, look, if we get rid of all of the people, we actually, yeah, we have some customers. That's what we have. But we don't have any ongoing technology. So to cut a long story short, we came through that restructure and we managed to get an investment from a company in Canada called the Chorus Group that owned Nelvana, which was one of our major development partners. But unfortunately, these the original investment group of the case and, you know, the finance people, they wanted to stay in. I say unfortunately because it leads to something that just happened last year. So they stayed in for a very small percentage, 15, 20%, all of them together in a little group. And then we had the chorus, and then of course we had the management. The year that we went through the restructure, all of our employees, and I really have to tell you that absolute credit goes to our employees for being totally focused. They kept doing their jobs as though nothing was going on. Myself and the chief financial officer were just out doing all of this stuff. Karina, who was responsible for our marketing group, the newsletter was coming out every quarter the way that it should. The products were being developed. We were now developing multiples of products. And the very year that we came through, we won our first Emmy. And so it was an incredible experience that we had a staff of people under this enormous pressure, and we got our first Emmy because 80% of television cartoons at this point were being done with our technology. So we felt quite emboldened and quite encouraged by this. And at that point, we decided, you know, there are a few things that we have to do. One is we have to become a multiple product company, because we were in a lot of danger with a lot of our business being sort of in this one space. And the other thing was that we needed to diversify. So we needed to work in more areas. We had at that time, because basically of the Disney relationship, we had built very, very strong business in China, Taiwan, Korea, and the Philippines, because that was where they had started to outsource to. So the sorts of actions that we took were, number one, we were going to develop new geographies. So we went to India. In fact, I got a Lifetime Achievement Award for building this industry in India, which really was, I would have to say, I was overwhelmed by that, because it was so unexpected. But building that industry in India, in fact, has ended up within India, it generating really hundreds of thousands of jobs in gaming, in web design, in special effects, you know, just from that very beginning. Because at that time, even though they had more live action productions than anywhere in the world, they were absolutely non-existent in this particular space. We also decided that we needed to have multiples of products. So we moved what we call down the food chain, where we redesigned our technology. We became a lot more modular so that we could appeal to a wider group, and we developed our storyboard product. Now, the storyboard product has been called the most revolutionary product in our space in the last 20 years, and that resulted in us getting our second Emmy last year. And again, completely unexpected. It's not common for a technology company to actually win 2 Emmys. And at the same time, we decided that we would move into the educational market, and we would move into what we call the consumer online, because we recognize that even though we were in a dominant position, and still are, with our major industrial pipeline product. So this product, for example, have any of you seen the Congress? So all the animation was done 100% with our technology. Just to give you an idea of some of the productions recently, The Princess and the Frog, of course, The Simpsons, Family Guy, all of those productions are done with our technology. And so that pipeline industrial product that enables someone to do a production in 7 different countries at the same time. We know that that's a reasonably finite business for us, that not everyone is going to be on that scale. And so we're very, very interested in the single user, the entrepreneur. With that group, we bring a lot to the table, because we are the glue that in fact holds a lot of the studios together. So we can facilitate introductions, we can enable them to generate a revenue stream while they're working on their own sort of creative content. But we also had this idea to develop technology for the K-12 market. And I'll just explain to you briefly how we backed into that. We backed into it by being very concerned about the state of education, specifically in the United States, because there are so many kids that are getting left behind. And as we're sitting around our office, of course, wouldn't you expect us to be discussing this as software engineers? We said, look, we don't believe that these children are stupid. What we believe is that they're bored silly in the classroom. We are the kings of coming up with technology for entertainment. Why can't we make it more entertaining for them to interact with their subject matter? And so we, in fact, brought out a product with a very simple user interface that could be mapped on to the everyday curriculum that the teachers are using. Again, that's an award-winning product, but even more significant is that the marks of the children went up in every subject, 17 to 20%. And we particularly tracked African Americans and Hispanics. And the African Americans and Hispanics moved right up to having the same marks as everybody else when they could utilize the left and right side of the brain. So then we thought, you know, we're on to something here. I was very fortunate to speak at the 2nd United Nations e-learning event that I spoke at in Namibia a month or 2 ago, because this is revolutionary. We have over 45,000 youngsters right now in India, but we will have millions in India being trained with this technology. We're in about 9,000 schools in the US and dealing at the governor level with how to be frank with you, I think that we should be replacing PowerPoint and other sort of archaic types of things with these types of technologies in the schools. So fundamentally, I was going to talk about what was the second incident that happened. This small group that stayed in, the portfolio was sold to a company in England called the Lothian Group. So this very, very small group of investors sold their piece to the Lothian Group, who bought up all of these investments that had been done in Quebec. We happened to be the most successful of those companies, and immediately they wanted to monetize. And this created a problem, because I was speaking earlier to a gentleman that's talking about the difficulty of financing when you're a bit of an older company. Now, it's very much easier to finance when you're brand new and everybody's really excited about you. But when you now are 10 years old, they think, this isn't as exciting for them, because now you're supposed to be in a steady state. So again, we went through the whole exercise of trying to get an investor to take them out. And fundamentally, what we did do a year ago was that we became a wholly owned subsidiary of the Chorus Group in Canada, which are major broadcasters and content generators. Now, our plan is not necessarily to stay in there. We may just try to hold in there for a while, you know, like a water skier behind the boat, and try to pop out again. So they're having a hard time getting their arms around us, because we definitely, and they know this, I mean, it's a discussion that there may in fact be a more appropriate partner for us somewhere else, that may be more in the technology field, or, you know, trying to push the envelope, push the edge, which is what we do. We're always having to push the edge of development, because if we don't, somebody else is going to come and take our spot. I mean, it's a nice spot to be in. And we do push the envelope on the high end by working closely with the studios, by listening to them. We have our engineers in there all the time. So apart from our own creative ideas, we certainly do listen a lot to the people that are using our technology. And on the education front, where we in fact were completely creative in our own right in thinking it should be there, we're now wanting to work collaboratively with other people in the educational space. We're doing some things in Turkey. We're talking about doing some things here where we would private label, language issues, etc. So whereas we do believe that we are creative ourselves, we think that we're way more creative if we collaborate with the people that actually use our technology. So I wanted to briefly talk about some of the lessons. If I go back to when we at Toon Boom wanted to move into these new spaces. So here we had what you might call an elitist product, dealing with these wonderful big studios on the best productions in the world, and this is what our engineering team were designing for. Then we introduced the fact that we wanted to move into education and consumer online. They didn't think it was good enough for them. And so we immediately ran into this barrier within our own organization. In fact, it was passive-aggressive, because where they paid lip service to it, they actually were not delivering on the products to go into these new spaces. And at the end of the day, there's no question there was a lot of water cooler discussions going on where the chief engineer and his group are saying they just don't know what they're talking about. You know, we know what we're doing. We're dealing with these guys, this stuff, this toys, these things that people are going to play with. There's no way. So at that point, I decided to set up a parallel team. And I set up a parallel team actually in another building. And it's interesting, you know, you always make mistakes. You keep thinking you'd learn and you won't make any more, but you do. So I set up the parallel team. That was a good thing. The bad thing was letting the old engineering group say, we can manage them. So I moved them back in, and woe and behold, would you not know that again, they sort of polluted this new group and they were not able. I can see you know what I'm talking about, eh? It's unbelievable trying to manage this stuff. And so now you're thinking, can they not see that we have to change, that we have to move, that we have to diversify, that we have to have 2 or 3 different sandboxes we're playing in? What are they doing? They're going to kill us. So anyway, I again brought in actually a consultant engineer. We set up a new consumer team, we've called it. That team is now separate and apart from what we will call the industrial team. And for what we're going to have to keep it that way, because at the end of the day, that feeling that some people have that you only want to be with the elite group and the other group are not worth it, it's very, very difficult until they see the results. Now, if we look at the education and we look at the consumer online, it's now over 1/3 of our revenue. Without those 2 revenue streams, we wouldn't be in the position we're in today. But trying to convince them was quite difficult. So this disagreement within organizations and the internal, let's call it debate. To be honest with you, it's poisonous. And you really have to be very focused in your leadership and your team's leadership in getting that boat to go forward, because at the end of the day, that is what can tip you over. The passive-aggressive political resistance is what I call it. And it's something that nobody talks about. It's just happening off-site. And they're all sitting there waiting for it to fail. And when it does fail, it's almost like they want to celebrate. I told you that wasn't going to work. You know, when you only, we have 100 people now. So when you have 4 or 5 people, it's a little bit more dynamic. It's easier to deal with. But you start getting into larger numbers, you get these subgroups, starting to emerge. I think from a technology company viewpoint that it's very, very important to understand that where you have brilliant technologists, you also need to have that brilliant communicator. And if I were to look at some of the major failures, it's because the successes are because those 2 are marching hand in hand. And so you can see it at Apple, when Steve Jobs was there. You could see it at BlackBerry now, that's really suffering. That when you have the great technologists with a great marketer and communicator, the companies are doing very, very well. And the minute that either the coupling is broken, in the case, unfortunately, of Steve Jobs, I mean, when he left before Apple went down, but I really do believe that now that he's not there, Apple is going to be in some trouble. It's not going to be able to move forward as much as it did while he was there. It's so very difficult to get those visionary geniuses that can stand out front. And then if you look at BlackBerry, it's exactly the same problem. And I was saying earlier that BlackBerry became an obvious problem when one of the founders was paying more attention to trying to buy a hockey team than he was to actually continuing the business going forward. So they took their eye off the ball. I mean, if you're in a technology company where you want the company to be sustained, and there are different objectives. Some people want to build it just to sell it. Now, of course, in our case, because we built this company to have this great brand recognition, to be in this dominant position, we actually want it to survive. And we had a situation last year where a company from Boston came in, they did due diligence and they wanted to buy us, which for those of us that have shares would have made more money. But I looked at myself in the mirror and I said, they're going to destroy this company. My husband, who's here over there, you were talking about running, he was an Olympic canoe racer, so we know all about pain. And I went for a run today too, but I don't look the same as she does. But anyway, but you know, at the end of the day, we knew that these people were going to destroy the company. I phoned Fred, he was on his way to the cottage. I said, you know what? The money isn't all there is here. I don't want these people to be out of work. And it was a real realization for me when I looked in the mirror that morning and I thought, I could retire tomorrow. And then I thought, what about the employees? We have on average people with us 12 to 15 years. They've trusted me as a leader. They've trusted us as a management team to worry about their income, to worry about their children's school fees, to have a moral responsibility. And I'm suddenly thinking, I'm not filthy rich, but I'm not poor. Am I willing to throw them under a bus? And the answer was no. And actually, I was quite happy to come to that conclusion. And so that was why we aligned with the Chorus Group, because I phoned them, I said, we're not going with these guys, it's not going to happen. And they said, okay, then you come into our fold for a while. I think that lack of focus going forward, I think people need to be extremely focused all the time, especially the leadership. You can do almost anything if you remain focused, but there's always the Monday morning quarterbacks that knew more than you did, knew better than you do, want to take you off track, and my advice is don't listen to any of them. If you are committed to what you think, if you're committed to your idea, you think it's a good one and you can move forward, take your own counsel, be focused, and move it forward, because there are a gazillion naysayers out there that are going to tell you day in and day out that what you're thinking is outright stupid. And if you listen to everybody, you're not going to get anywhere. So that would be one of my words of advice. And again, I agree, stick as far away as you can from some of the types of investments. Truly, they can be onerous and get you into horrible, horrible trouble. I was sorry that I inherited that situation. I do, however, think that having gone through what I did with the Philips experience and actually having had the training from companies like IBM was why I was able to reach very deep inside myself and be able to really pull our people forward and for them to trust me enough to do that. So I think that everything that you learn as you're going forward with every experience that you have really enables you to do the next step. And sometimes you're in a place for a reason. And I think I was there for that reason, to be able to bring this company through and to be able to keep our wonderful employees doing great things. So that's all I had to say. Thank you very much.